Hello again. Today I'm going to talk to you about rondo form and also about the typical last movement of a multi-movement work, which, as I said in the previous lecture, about half the time the last movement of a multi-movement instrumental work in the classical era, whether it is a 4-movement work or a 3-movement work, that last movement will have a fast tempo, and it will usually either be in sonata form, which we've already learned about in a previous lecture. That's the form with 3 main sections: exposition, development, and recapitulation. Or that last movement will be in rondo form. Now, I'm introducing them separately, rondo form and last movements, because they aren't necessarily the same thing. We could actually have a movement that is in rondo form that isn't the last movement. For example, the second movement of a multi-movement work is sometimes in rondo form. And in a future lecture, probably the next lecture, we will listen to a work by Beethoven that has a rondo as its second movement, as its slow movement, and also as its final movement. Right? So we can find rondo form in a variety of different places, but last movements in particular, about half the time, tend to be in rondo form, maybe even a little more than half the time. Okay, there are 2 types of rondo, and again, referring to this handout, which I sent you guys as an attachment, rondo is the last type of form that's discussed under Roman numeral 4, because, again, last movements about half the time, 4th movements or finales, that's true for 3rd movements of 3-movement works as well. Last movements tend to be in rondo form at least half the time, and there are 2 varieties of rondo here. There's the short and the long. Okay. Now, the only difference between the 2 of them is the short rondo has 5 sections, the long rondo has 7 sections, but the basic idea is the same, which is that we have a main theme, okay? And when that main theme is being presented, as it is at the very beginning, we could label that the A section, okay? We have that opening A section with that main theme, and that main theme may be restated within the A section, because again, just like in sonata form, the composer wants to make you very familiar with these themes before he goes off and does something else, or before he starts changing these themes or moving into another key or whatever. Wants to make sure the audience can recognize these themes when they reappear later. Right? So they're treated sort of like characters. That I'm realizing now that I haven't really defined what a theme is. Is it just a melody? Well, not exactly. Not every melody qualifies to be a theme. Maybe the easiest definition for what a theme is, it is a melody of great significance. Sort of like a main character in a work of literature. Not every character is a main character, and not every melody, every tune, every melodic snippet that you might hear in a piece of music really counts as a theme. In order for it to be a theme, it has to be a melody which reappears, which perhaps undergoes changes, which we become familiar with enough that we have a sort of we recognize when it returns, we have a sense of attachment to it, the same way we might have an attachment to a particular character in a work of fiction, let's say. And one of the ways that an author makes us feel that special affinity or recognize that character is to give us a certain amount of familiarity with that character. So very often in a movie, in a TV show, in a novel, we are introduced to the characters first, and we go through a little bit of their everyday life. Maybe not necessarily having a lot of action, but just getting to know them in their everyday life before the action starts, before the tension and the drama. All right. So the analogous thing in a piece of music where we have themes instead of characters is we simply restate themes so that we can recognize them easier. especially at the beginning. We might not need to restate them too much later on when they reappear. When they reappear, they might just appear once and not necessarily be restated. It depends. But in a rondo form, we have that A theme, the first thing that we hear. It may or may not be repeated. And then we have something different. We can call that something different B, something that is definitely contrasting in character. And after we've heard that something different, which we label B, that main theme returns again, A. Right? And then after that, something different yet again, which we would label C, because it's not the same as B or A. Right? Now, A will return, and if we have a 5-part rondo, that's basically where we stop. A, B, A, C, A. Maybe we'll have a coda, a concluding section tacked on the end. Right? So that would be A, B, A, C, A, coda. Maybe or maybe not. Remember, the coda is an optional concluding section which we can find tacked on to the end of any piece in any era, not necessarily just the classical era, not necessarily a piece in rondo form. A coda is sort of an all-purpose concluding section. Okay, so that would be the short rondo, the 5-part rondo, A, B, A, C, A. The long rondo is the same basic principle. We have the recurring A theme, and we have different stuff, contrasting stuff, these what we call episodes perhaps, the contrasting episodes of B, and the return of A, and then C, and the return of A. The only difference in the long rondo is the B material comes back once more, but we can't end there. We can't end with the B material. We got to bring the A material back one more time, right? So the long rondo is sometimes called the 7-part rondo. A, B, A, C, A, B, A. In addition to that, we may or may not have a coda. Or we might have a coda that is also could be seen as the A section. That final A section may sort of do double duty as the coda, in addition to being a final restatement of A. And there are little tweaks, there are little variations that are possible, but the basic form of a rondo is usually either 5-part or 7-part, and it's A, something else, A, something else, A, right? And this something else, these contrasting episodes, provide the necessary variety, and the return of the A section provides the necessary continuity. In fact, this is why they call it a rondo, really. Think of a merry-go-round, where that A section keeps coming back around, and when the A section is absent, we have something else, something contrasting, something different. This form, by the way, is also very similar to a form that we've already learned about back in the Baroque era. Ritornello form. Ritornello form is very similar in principle to rondo form, right? It's the same basic idea. The only difference is ritornello form is something we usually associate with the Baroque, whereas rondo is more associated with the classical era. Ritornello form is particularly associated with concertos, especially, whereas rondo form in the classical era, we could find it in a classical symphony or chamber music or in a concerto. Also, in the Baroque ritornello form, we call the main theme the ritornello, and it returns every once in a while. And yes, in between the returns of the ritornello, we have different stuff, contrasting stuff. But we have the additional complication that usually when we are hearing the ritornello being presented, it's the entire orchestra, the tutti in a concerto. And usually when we have the contrasting material, those contrasting episodes, it's the soloist or the soloists, right? And this is all review. Okay, this is stuff from the Baroque era, but it kind of carries over into the classical era. It's a very similar idea. We have a main theme. We don't call it the ritornello anymore. We just call it the main theme or the A theme. And in between the returns of the A theme, we have different contrasting stuff. All right, so a little bit more material here underneath these diagrams in your handout. It says here, notice that the C section in a rondo often has the same function as the development section of a sonata form. So if you look at this rondo, especially if you look at the long rondo, ABA, CABA, it's kind of similar to sonata form in a way. If you look at that first A and think of it as being sort of like theme 1, and the B section as being sort of like theme 2 within the exposition, and if we look at the C section as being sort of like a development, or if the composer looks at it that way and says, aha, I could treat this C section in the middle as sort of like a development. I could do the same kind of things in this C section as I would do in the development of a sonata form. Remember, the development section is where the composer increases tension, modulates through different keys, maybe breaks the themes down and reconfigures them in some way, and also provides sort of the peak tension, modulates to different keys. All of these things, maybe some polyphonic texture, for example, we might find in that C section. And then notice how after that C section we have A and B coming back again, if we're talking about a 7-part rondo. And that's sort of like the return of theme 1 and theme 2 in sonata form in the recapitulation, right? So the long rondo kind of has some similarity to sonata form, and composers sometimes deliberately played up this similarity, and we see sometimes a sort of a hybrid called sonata rondo. Sonata rondo is when we have a long rondo, in particular, a 7-part rondo, where the C section in the middle has the character of a development, where there's a deliberate sort of ratcheting up of intensity, breaking down thematic material, right? Deliberate sort of added complexity and tension in that C section. And also maybe making that C section a bit longer, right? And so if we have that going on, we might say, that's an example of a sonata rondo, sort of a hybrid between sonata form and rondo form. Okay, what I want to do now is listen to an example of, now this is going to be a 7-part rondo, which is the finale of a string quartet by Beethoven. Before I do that though, now it's going to be in rondo form, okay, and it's going to be the last movement. I want to talk a little bit about the genre of the string quartet before we listen to it. So, first of all, the string quartet is a genre of chamber music. And remember, chamber music is simply instrumental music for a small group. And in chamber music, not only is it for a small group, but a couple other particularities apply. So chamber music is not conducted. We don't have a conductor standing up there waving his or her arms. Instead, the various players just kind of keep together by nodding to each other and just kind of keep time amongst themselves. Also in chamber music, we have one person per part, meaning each individual, there's no duplication. Each individual has their own unique notes, right? Unlike, let's say, in a symphony orchestra, where if you are in the first violin section, you and maybe a dozen other people are all playing the same notes, and then over in the second violin section, all the second violinists are playing the same notes, and in the cello section, etc. There's duplication of notes within parts, within sections, and some of these sections have more players, some of them have less, but there is duplication. In chamber music, there is no duplication, which means every individual player has kind of like something unique to say. And therefore, chamber music is more conversational, I guess. And it's a little bit more intense because you don't have the anonymity, maybe, of playing in a big section. Chamber music is important in both the Baroque and in the classical era, and going forward in the Romantic era, not just because, let's say, audiences like to hear it, or professional musicians liked to play chamber music, which they did. Maybe even more significant is that middle-class amateur musicians played chamber music in their homes. Remember, this is a time before recorded music. So if you liked music, and people then were just as crazy about music back in those days as we are today. The difference is they couldn't listen to recorded music, right? They did have public concerts. Okay, those concerts had to be in much smaller venues. There was no such thing as amplification. It was all just purely unplugged acoustic, But so they had concert series of, let's say, in opera houses or in philharmonic orchestras or whatever. But they also like to make music at home. And if you like to hear music at home, the only way that you could have that would be to create it yourself. Because again, there's no recorded music in the 18th or 19th centuries. Okay, so composers kind of kept this in mind, and chamber music was often composed not necessarily for professionals, but also for amateurs, because composers wanted all these gifted amateur middle-class musicians who played chamber music at home. They wanted to sell music, to sell sheet music to these people, right? So chamber music was not necessarily always geared toward professionals. And remember, in the Baroque era, as in the Classical era, as in the Romantic era, among educated middle-class people, the level of musicianship was quite high. The average, let's say, middle-class and higher person could read music, could play an instrument, probably pretty well. The average middle-class home had a piano in the house, and not just to hold up picture frames or to collect dust or to look like a nice classy piece of furniture. Guaranteed there was someone in the house who could play the piano, probably the ladies of the house in particular. Women in these days, it was sort of a mark of a cultured, educated woman to be able to play the piano, to sing nicely, maybe to play the violin. So not all music was created by or for professional musicians. And just because you're an amateur doesn't mean you're not necessarily, really quite good. The level of amateur musicianship in these times was quite high. Okay. Of all the different genres of chamber music which existed, and the book talks about them, on page, let's see. The book talks about chamber music generally on page 177. There's a paragraph here, if you're using the 9th brief edition, on classical chamber music. And they talk about the different genres, the different formats, okay? And you should know those. So you should know, for example, what a piano trio is. 3 pianos? No, actually. It's for violin, cello, and piano. That's a piano trio. All right. But of all the different types of chamber music in the classical era, the most important, let's say, the most serious, the one that composers tended to take the most seriously and sort of pour the most of their heart and soul into, was the string quartet. Now, you might recall from an earlier lecture, I mentioned that Haydn, the oldest of our 3 classical composers, is considered the father of the string quartet. He didn't really invent the string quartet. He wasn't the first person to compose works with the title string quartet, but he did perhaps more than anyone else to sort of standardize the format and the style, the procedures of creating string quartets. And later quartet composers like Beethoven and Mozart, both of whom knew Haydn and his quartets very, very well. And in the case of Beethoven, actually studied as a student of Haydn's. Both Mozart and Beethoven deliberately, studied and modeled their quartets very often upon the example set by Haydn. So that's why Haydn is known as the father of the string quartet. Now, you might think, string quartet, that must have a violin, a viola, a cello, and a bass, because those are the 4 instruments of the bowed, string family, of the violin family. Violin, viola, cello, bass, 4 instruments, that's a string quartet. No. turns out there are two violins, a first violin and a second violin, viola and cello. That's the instrumentation for a string quartet. There is no bass in a string quartet. First violin, second violin, viola, and cello. And one of the things, by the way, that Haydn kind of established as one of the expectations in a string quartet is that it wouldn't just be the first violin having the melody all the time and the others like playing literally second fiddle or providing just accompaniment and bass line. Part of the idea, part of the fun of a string quartet is that the composer gives each of these different instruments some significant material. It's not just like the violin always has the melody and the others are just doing pa-pas or some kind of, just playing chords or just being in the background. The idea is that as much as possible, you try and give significant melodic material and interesting notes to all four of the different players. Now, it's true that the first violin usually kind of takes the lead, but there's interesting tunes and melodies for all four players, and that's what makes a string quartet. It's one of the things that appeals to the composer about a string quartet. Okay, so what we're going to listen to now, and there's a listening guide for this, over here on page 174, over to 175. This is the last movement of a string quartet composed by Beethoven when he was around 30 years old. This is the last of his Opus 18 string quartets. Oh no, not the last, but it's one of a set of 6 quartets that Beethoven composed that are known as his Opus 18. What the heck does that mean, Opus 18? It just means that it's Beethoven's 18th published work. The word opus simply means work in Latin. And some composers, especially during this time and later, either the composers themselves or their publishers would put this number after the title of their works when they went to print, when they were published, the opus number. And it just indicates where in the sequence of the composer's publications that work would appear. So Beethoven's Opus 18 is a set of 6 string quartets. And what we're going to hear is the last movement of Opus 18, number 4, which is a quartet in C minor. And this last movement happens to be in rondo form. It's fast, as we would expect. Right? And it's also in the gypsy style. So this is another thing about music of the classical era and also the Romantic era. The music of the gypsies, which are, the gypsies, of course, are and I guess it's impolite to call them gypsies anymore. They are known today as Roma, but they were known for hundreds of years as gypsies, and they still exist in Europe. They are a nomadic people, a sort of a subculture within Europe who, these days, they live in campers, and they camp out, and they travel throughout Europe. They camp, they travel from one place to another. Sometimes they set up little sort of flea markets or bazaars. In the old days, they traveled in coaches, but they would camp out and move from one place to another. And they had their own unique culture and their own music, their own style of music, which was imitated by composers who found something interesting about the style of gypsy music. Gypsy music was very often either very fast and wild and dance-like, or very slow and brooding and melancholy and kind of over-the-top, kind of sobbing and very emotional and sort of bipolar in a way. So there's something that appealed to not only classical composers like Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, all of whom wrote music imitating the style of the gypsies, but even more so perhaps in the 19th century. So composers like Liszt and Brahms and many others. If you're familiar, for example, with the opera by Bizet, Carmen, a lot of gypsy music because it's in the plot of the opera Carmen, a Spanish soldier goes AWOL, deserts his unit because he falls in love with a gypsy girl, right? And of course, bad things happen. Anyway, the gypsy style, gypsy music was very popular in the 18th and 19th century, and Beethoven deliberately composed this movement and meant for it to sound like gypsy music. So this is in gypsy style, but rondo form, and I'm going to talk through it a little bit and point out the various sections when they happen. So you might want to listen to this separately on my liked videos on the YouTube channel. You can find this and listen to it without me talking over it. And you can also find it in the Camion listening list on the online book material. But for now, let's listen to it, and I'm going to talk over it and point out when these various sections occur. Okay. Let's try this right. Wait a minute. Here it is. Here we go. Okay, so obviously this is the A theme, and it's restated. And this theme is actually in binary form. We're hearing the repeat of the B phrase. And now, something different. So this is the B section of our long rondo. And notice the mood is different. This melody is a little bit more graceful, a little bit more lyrical. It doesn't have that driving energy that the A theme has. The book refers to it as a lyrical theme. Okay, we're coming to the end of that first B section, and now the A theme comes back. And that driving energy comes back. Now, when Beethoven brings back that A theme, it's not necessarily literally exactly the same. There are little tweaks, little alterations. Now, here's something different completely. This is the C section, and we have these this little upward flourish every time. Here it is again. That's the main feature, the main motive of this C section, this upward. Okay, now we've moved past it. We're already into the next A section. It's the familiar A melody. Again, it's not a verbatim repetition, but it's close enough that you recognize it. There's some little variations, but it's recognizable. Now, here's a little bridge section. Beethoven is kind of leading us on, like what comes next. Oh, it's a return of the B theme, the lyrical theme. Okay, so now we've heard a return of B. Now, this is another bridge section. Beethoven is giving us hints of what's going to follow. We have one A section, one return of A, and Beethoven is building up to that. Kind of building up the expectation. And here it is. It's even faster. It's one last kind of furious version of the A section. And we have a coda. We have a concluding section, so it goes on and on. at the very end, Beethoven does something very clever. He brings back the C material. Remember this upward. Okay. At the very, very end, he just brings back that material from this C section. Now, this was not a sonata rondo. The C section in this particular movement was actually pretty short. And we didn't really get to hear too much of that motive, that brum, 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 those upward flourishes. And so I think that's kind of the reason why Beethoven brings that brum, 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 those upward flourishes back at the very, very end of the piece, at the tail end of the coda. Okay, now everything that I said there, it might have just kind of gone by and you're like, what the heck is he talking about? You need to listen to it maybe more than once, listen to it with the handout, and maybe with the listening guide, which is, again, pages 174 and 175, I believe. Form, again, I don't expect you to necessarily get the form of a piece of music the first time through, right? It takes listening once or twice or three times. Say, aha, this is how it works. This is why it's built the way it is. And once you understand the form, actually, it becomes much more satisfying to listen to this kind of music. You might think that, like, well, where's the imagination? If these composers are just, going through the motions, kind of reusing, recycling these same forms, isn't that not terribly creative? No, actually, because what the composer is doing is he's working within the limitations of that form and trying to be creative with those restrictions, which is actually more challenging and more interesting than just saying, oh, I don't pay any attention to form. I'm just going to do whatever I want. I'm just going to sort of, freestyle. Usually it doesn't turn out all that well. And in fact, we find this in all kinds of music, in popular music. A pop musician, a pop star, rock star, whatever, may not necessarily be thinking of it at an intellectual, abstract level, like, oh, I'm going to have this kind of form. But they are aware of, they've grown up with certain forms, certain procedures, certain expectations, let's say, certain styles that they have taken in and are maybe working at a subconscious level. Form is kind of inescapable in music. It's just that in the classical era in particular, there's more of an emphasis on it because part of the classical style is simply the idea that what generates beauty is form. Beauty and form are inextricable from each other. Okay, what I think I'll do in the next lecture is talk about ways in which 3-movement works might differ from 4-movement works. So I've already talked about the basic difference between a 4-movement work and a 3-movement work, and that is simply that usually the dance-like movement, which is the third out of 4, is missing. So in a 3-movement work, we have a first movement which is in sonata form and fast, a second movement which is in some other form and is slow, and a final movement which is in either sonata form or maybe rondo form and is fast in tempo again. Right? There are some peculiarities, though, especially with the concerto. The classical concerto, basically all the stuff that I've talked about applies, but there are a couple little exceptions that we need to talk about. So for next time, read about the classical symphony and the classical concerto and classical chamber music. And also skip ahead a little bit to the section on Mozart and listen to, find Mozart's Piano Concerto number 23, which is, a little bit, let's see, where is it in the book? It's in there somewhere. Find Mozart's Piano Concerto number 23 and listen to that, and we will talk about that next time. See ya.